Hello and welcome to video number 2 for today on the educational series in my YouTube channel, Flexible Fitness and Conditioning. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to try to be concise. I have a problem with being a little long-winded, so I just want to stick to the topic at hand, which is answering the age-old question, is there an optimal squat form? Is there a best squat form for the masses? Short answer, no. Long answer, it depends, which is always the answer in the exercise wellness field, whether it be nutrition or sport performance, or regardless, it always depends. So we're going to get right into it. Regardless if you're well versed in biomechanics, hopefully you take some new variable that, you take something away from this, like a new variable that affects squat form. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of them at you. And yeah, hopefully something's new. So the first thing I want to talk about is anthropometrics as variables that affect squat form. Two that fall under anthropometrics that are very common and often used to represent how they would affect squat form are femur length and body weight, or where you hold your body weight. So the first thing to understand is while you're squatting, the whole time you're squatting, your body, your center of mass has to be within your footprint. If your center of mass projected down is in front of your foot, you'll have to step forward. If it's behind your foot, you're going to have to step back. So you have to keep it in there. So if something goes back, something has to counterbalance and go forward, or vice versa. If something goes forward, something has to go back. So your average weight or position or mass has to stay within that footprint. So now you can kind of start understanding how femur length would affect your squat form. So just quick example, if I have very long femur lengths, I'm going to have to counterbalance a lot because a lot of weight is going posteriorly, a lot of weight's going back. The longer the femur, the more I'm going to have to counterbalance or hip flex, or flex at the hip to be able to keep my weight over my feet. Vice versa, if I have short femurs, then I can stay way more upright in my squat form. Just like that, we're going body weight, or where you hold your body weight, whether it's android or gynoid, is going to affect your squat form as well. If you hold your weight higher, then you not only don't have to counterbalance a lot or a lot of hip flexion, but you don't want to, because if you go like this, you can fall forward because all your weight's up there. So you can be a lot more upright, a lot more vertical thoracic, vertical spine, versus someone who holds their weight lower in their hips almost, if their center of mass is lower in that like 50% of their height range, then all of a sudden when they squat, a lot of their weight's going back, so therefore they're going to have to counterbalance a lot. So that's just 2 examples of how arthropometrics can affect squat form. And then the next one we want to talk about is range of motion or joint mobility. Common one talked about and worked on is ankle flexibility or mobility. We're going to talk about mobility when it comes to squat because it's the ability to be able to function in that range of motion. So not just get into that degree of flexion or extension, but be able to create strength and stability in that range of motion. So yeah, dorsiflexion, I have pretty good dorsiflexion, the ability to bring my toes to my shin. Therefore, I can track forward pretty far on my squat. And you can imagine if you can't do that, you're going to have a very vertical shin angle and have to counterbalance a lot with that chest again, right? So if I can squat, if those knees can track forward on my squat, and we'll talk about knees over toes in a second, then all of a sudden I can be way more vertical and I don't have that issue. You can see how ankle dorsiflexion would affect squat form, and you could always make the argument that they shouldn't be squatting until they had a sufficient amount of dorsiflexion. But let's say but there is a spectrum of far and of high dorsiflexion and low dorsiflexion, and working within your range will affect squat form, period. So another example of joint mobility or range of motion is in the hips. I'm trying to think of retroversion and antroversion. The guy on Squat University talked about this, and it's just the angle of the head of the femur, of how it comes out of the acetabulum in the hips. And that's going to affect your stance. So that's just one example. Another one is depth of that acetabulum. How far does that femur sit in there? And what that affects is impingement. So you might have to widen your stance or externally rotate your hips to avoid that femur running into the wall of the acetabulum. So that's going to affect it, and that's of no fault of your own. You can't work on that. That's anatomical. So yeah, range of motion is a big one. Bar position. So whether you go high bar, low bar, or front squat is going to affect your squat form. And this you could say, well, that's different. You could say there's a low bar optimal squat form, high bar optimal, and then front squat. But again, it's going to be a continuum somewhere in there. Someone might be more comfortable lower. Someone might not have the shoulder flexibility and keep it higher, or what have you. So all of a sudden, those things are going to affect squat form regardless of what type of bar position you're cueing them on. So just for a quick example, the lower the bar, the farther you are going to have to counterbalance, right? And then the higher the bar, so this is the spectrum. Low bar, very, your torso is going to track more horizontal. Front squats on the other side of the spectrum, and that's going to keep a very vertical torso, right? So the weight is already forward. You don't want to lean forward anymore with it, because we're trying to keep above our center of mass above that base, right? And then high bar, right in the middle, let's say, of that continuum, there's going to be more flexion of the hip, more horizontal track of that torso than the front squat, but less than the low bar position. So that's how just bar position can affect it. Next, muscle recruitment and percent 1 rep max. So the heavier you get is going to affect squat form. I think it just comes naturally. It's usually it's not cued. It's just if you put more weight on it, you tend to do more hip flexion. The lighter the more upright you can be. And that's just, you can utilize some bigger muscle groups. That posterior chain is going to take over a little bit more. And then also you can purposefully do a different movement, change your squat form to target certain areas. So you could say that person's not squatting right. Well, what if they're specifically trying, so it almost looks like a good morning, they're hedging on that side of things because they're just trying to hit the posterior chain. So that's another variable that affects squat form, what you're trying to hit and then at what weight you're hitting. So you always have to be aware of that as well. And then also people make the argument of muscle recruitment in the sense that like the more knee tracking, so let's go with front squat is more anterior, back squat is more posterior dominant. I know there's a lot of studies contradicting this, and it's sad that I just don't feel confident enough to speak on that, which is crazy because your initial reaction is like, oh yeah, front squat, anterior, right? That's more quad dominant. Back squat, posterior, more but if you, and of course it is, if you look at a front squat and they're going ass to grass, right? If they're going deep in there, then you're gonna get you got way more knee flexion. So you're taking the quads through a larger range of motion, so then it's gonna be a more quad dominant movement, right? Versus if they're doing back squat, let's say, and they're just going to parallel. All of a sudden, you have way less range of motion on those quads. So you could easily make the argument that it's not hitting the quads as much. But shouldn't you control for range of motion? Shouldn't the depth be the same? Yes, and that's weight is one thing, obviously. You can't front squat as much as you can back squat. So they have to control for that somehow. Like, are they gonna, so they have EKGs or EMGs hooked up to the muscles. So that's what affects these studies. The weight, you have to be like, okay, they can squat more in back squat than front squat. So do we weight them more? And now, of course, they're gonna have more muscle activation in the glutes if the weight is heavier, right? And then also you have to take into account the thing I said previous, which is the idea of depth, squat depth. Okay, time for the last variable I want to talk about that can affect squat form. So there is other reasons or other variables or other factors that will change squat form, but the last one I want to talk about is contraindications to certain form techniques, okay? So we're going to dive into the knees over toes conversation. So originally, the best way to tackle this is to go through the progression of research, and that was they did a bunch of studies and had people cue up vertical shin angle, so their knees did not track over their toes. They purposely had them squat, pushing their hips back, right? And what they saw was way less tension being driven through that patellar tendon and patellar ligament, right? And then they cued up someone, compared to someone who they cued up knees track over their toes, right? All of a sudden, all the movements being done with their quads, and there was a lot more tension there, right? A lot more stress in the anterior part of the knee. And they go, there you go, squatting knees over toes is bad for your knees, right? And that blew up. But then later in more recent studies, and because that idea of having knees over toes didn't really jive with the practical field. Olympic weightlifters had some of the healthiest knees ever, and their knees go way over their toes, right? So they were like, why is the research saying A, and then in practical application, B is actually true? Well, later they found out, well, what if we cue up? The big problem with that study was where they were putting the pressure in their feet. So when you squat and you cue them, track your knees way over your toes, people were just standing on their balls of their feet and driving their knees forward, right? They were like this. It was almost like a TKE step down just to work their quads. And yes, of course, that's going to send way more stress through their knee. Well, then they cued them up instead to do tripod position. Very popular. I utilize it. It's a great way to cue them up. And all it is that you tripod 3 positions to equally distribute your pressure, your foot pressure. So you're going to go 2 in the front in the ball of the feet, and then 1 in the heel. So the second they did that, squat form looked a lot more natural. And even when the knees tracked over their toes, there was a lot more posterior activation. And all the movement was not coming from the knees. Way more healthier. Debunked it and really opened the relationship between research and the practical field again. Okay, now we can see why some of the best front squats and catching a clean in depth look the way they do, right? And yet they can still go out and walk every day and run and jump and be high performing athletes. So but you can now kind of see how this would affect squat form. Let's say you do have bad knees. It is the case that the more your knees track forward, the worse or more tension, the more force there is in that knee. So in that anterior knee portion. So if you have bad knees and you squat, maybe it is okay to keep a more vertical shin and keep that tension in your back, glutes, and posterior chain. So you squat here, you might have to lean forward a little bit more, and that could affect your squat form. Contrary to that, what if you have lower back problems and you don't want that shear stress on your lower back? Well, what's the best way then is to not make the moment arm come from your spine, But to make it come from your knees, if your knees feel great and you have no contraindications to tracking your knees well over your toes, and you can keep that upright back position, then you can use that technique to allow you to squat more often. So finally, that's as a final statement to answer the question, is there an optimal squat form? Yes, for your specific anthropometrics, for example, your femur length and your body weight distribution. If you have a very specific joint mobility, hip abduction ability, and that kind of gets into the femur length too. People will abduct more for longer femurs so they don't have to lean forward. I forgot to talk about that in the beginning. Bar position, what percent 1 rep max you're doing, what muscles you're trying to recruit, what contraindications or injuries you're trying to avoid. All those things factor in, and yes, you can get an optimal squat form for this recipe or this individual person. So no, there isn't one for the masses that you can prescribe for everyone. But yes, you can always do more work. Even some of the best strength coaches I've had or worked with go, hey Lex, come over here and watch me squat, or watch me catch this clean. And I, at the time, knew nothing, but just having a second pair of eyes, looking at what they're doing, tracking the video in slow motion, whatever, what have you, really helps out.